He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy.
Most people who grew up with Lost in Space remember the same handful of images. A silver robot waving its arms, a cowardly stowaway in a silver jumpsuit, and a family of astronauts stranded somewhere past Alpha Centauri. What most fans never figured out is that almost everything they loved about the show was never supposed to exist in the first place. The robot wasn't supposed to matter. The villain wasn't supposed to survive the pilot. And the actor cast as the heroic leader of the family was never told, in so many words, that his own show was quietly being taken away from him. This is the story behind the story, what the cast lived through, what they hid for decades, and what finally came out as, one by one, they began to disappear. When Irwin Allen sold Lost in Space to CBS, the pitch was nothing like what audiences eventually watched. The original pilot, a serious hour-long film called No Place to Hide, played more like a survival drama than a science fiction adventure. There was no robot. There was no saboteur. A brilliant family of astronauts is knocked off course and has to use intelligence and teamwork to stay alive on a hostile planet. It was expensive, polished, and dead serious, the kind of prestige science fiction CBS executives rarely got handed on a silver platter. CBS loved it enough to buy the series on the spot, and then immediately asked Irwin Allen to break it. They wanted a recurring antagonist, something with teeth that could generate conflict every single week without inventing a brand new threat from scratch. They wanted a robot because robots sold toys. So the somber survival story became something else entirely. A saboteur named Dr. Zachary Smith was written in, a robot was bolted onto the ship, and roughly 80% of that original, serious pilot footage was later chopped up and folded into the first handful of episodes, with a flimsy explanation invented to justify why the villain and the robot were mysteriously absent from scenes that had actually been filmed almost a year before either character existed. Few fans ever registered that the theme music that opens every single episode was written by a 24-year-old staff composer named Johnny Williams, a man the world would later know as John Williams, composer of Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones. Fewer still knew that the interior of the Jupiter 2 was, at the time, the most expensive standing set in television history, costing more to build than the bridge of the Enterprise on Star Trek. Jonathan Harris was never supposed to survive more than 5 episodes. As written, Dr. Smith was a cold, professional saboteur who murders a security guard in the pilot and reprograms the robot to kill the Robinson family in their sleep. He was designed to be irredeemable and disposable. Harris, a former pharmacist's son from the Bronx, who had reinvented his entire identity, changing his surname at 17 against his father's wishes and fabricating an acting resume to break into the business, looked at that death sentence of a role and quietly decided he wasn't going to let it kill his career. So he started rewriting his own scenes. He would arrive on set with pages he'd written the night before, hand them to the rest of the cast, and simply announce that the dialogue had changed. Bill Mumy, a child actor at the time, later described watching this happen with something close to awe. Harris engineering every beat of an episode so that it kept circling back to Smith, inventing his own vocabulary of absurd insults for the robot that never appeared in any script at all. Within roughly a year, the character had generated hundreds of fan letters a month, and Irwin Allen, who hadn't planned any of it, had no real choice but to embrace what Harris had built. Allen later admitted publicly that he hadn't designed Smith to be funny. Harris had simply decided that's what the character would become, and made it true through sheer repetition and nerve. Harris eventually negotiated a special guest star credit on every episode of the series, an arrangement that was unusual for American television at the time. Guy Williams arrived on Lost in Space already famous, having spent 4 years as the title character in Disney's Zorro. He was cast as John Robinson, the family's commanding officer, and the character the series was originally built around. What happened instead was a slow, almost polite erasure. As Dr. Smith's storylines expanded season after season, Williams' screen time contracted at nearly the same rate, until by the final season, he was often reduced to a handful of lines per episode, while Harris, the robot, and young Bill Mumy carried entire installments on their own. cast members later described real tension on set over what was happening, and Harris himself, the person most responsible for it, acknowledged how difficult it must have been for an actor who had been hired to lead a series to end up with almost nothing to do. Williams reportedly filled the long, idle hours on set with chess, classical music, and stock trading, and the crew nicknamed him the Comb for how often he groomed his hair between takes he barely appeared in. His career afterward tells one of the strangest split stories in television history. In the United States, being remembered mainly as the background of his own show didn't help him find new leading roles. But in Argentina, his earlier fame as Zorro had turned into something close to genuine national affection, and he spent much of the rest of his life there, treated as a celebrity by a country that had never stopped watching his old work. He died alone in his Buenos Aires apartment in 1989 of a ruptured brain aneurysm. Because he lived by himself and mobile phones didn't yet exist, his body wasn't discovered for roughly a week, after friends grew concerned and alerted police. No character in the show was more beloved and more anonymous than the robot. Bob May climbed inside that nearly 200-pound suit for 3 seasons, and the experience was closer to physical endurance than acting. Under studio lighting, the inside of the costume became almost unbearably hot, and on at least a couple of documented occasions, May passed out from lack of oxygen mid-scene before crew members realized what was happening. Filming reportedly continued around these incidents rather than stopping for them. May was also a heavy smoker and would light cigarettes inside the costume between takes, resulting in the enduring story of Irwin Allen once panicking at the sight of smoke pouring out an apparently empty robot suit, only to learn it was May on a smoke break, after which, the story goes, any scripted robot smoke effect became May's job to generate personally. Despite carrying the physical performance of one of the era's most recognizable television characters, May was never credited on screen for a single episode across the show's entire run. A decision that also meant reduced pay and diminished residuals, as the franchise kept generating money for decades afterward. He and his wife were later living in a mobile home park when a wildfire destroyed their home in 2008. He died of heart failure only a couple of months later. Those who knew him from the convention circuit remembered him less for any bitterness about how he'd been treated, and more for an almost bottomless patience with fans, reportedly staying at signing tables until literally everyone waiting had gotten their moment with him. It's become common knowledge that Star Trek is remembered as the more prestigious, more culturally significant show of the two. What gets left out is that during their original broadcast runs, Lost in Space consistently beat Star Trek in the ratings, sometimes by a wide margin. The two shows were even connected before either existed. CBS passed on Gene Roddenberry's original pitch for Star Trek, specifically because it was already developing Lost in Space, and didn't want a competitor in the same genre, pushing Roddenberry to sell the show to NBC instead. The most amusing artifact of their rivalry involves a set of pointed alien ears. When the Lost in Space makeup department needed prosthetic ears for an alien character, and was short on both time and budget, they reportedly borrowed the actual molds used for Spock's ears from the Star Trek production and repainted them. Fans on the Star Trek side accused the rival show of stealing the design outright, when the real explanation was simply that makeup artists from both productions were friends who shared resources to survive impossible shooting schedules. Inside the Jupiter 2, meanwhile, Bill Mumy and Angela Cartwright, cast as young Will and Penny Robinson, and only 10 and 13 years old respectively when filming began, grew up together on that soundstage, were tutored together, and eventually dated as teenagers before a brief engagement in the early 1970s that ended quietly and without resentment. What's remarkable is what came after. Rather than drifting apart the way most young co-stars do, they stayed close for the rest of their lives, co-authoring books together and still appearing at fan conventions side by side well into their 70s. And in a detail that undercuts the entire idea of a bitter rivalry between the two franchises, Mumy was privately a devoted Star Trek viewer the entire time he was working on its supposed competitor, eventually appearing decades later in a Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode as a Starfleet officer who dies on screen, a role the producers reportedly enjoyed casting specifically because it meant killing off Will Robinson. Lost in Space never got a finale. The show simply stopped mid-story with the Robinson family still stranded and the cast under the impression a fourth season had already been arranged. It hadn't. CBS offered to renew the series only with a significant budget cut, and Irwin Allen refused the terms, effectively ending the show over money rather than ratings. The cancellation notice reached the cast with almost no ceremony, no on-set announcement, no farewell gathering, just a trade notice and a handful of phone calls, leaving performers who had spent 3 years of their lives on the project to find out it was over the same way the public did. Fittingly, one of the clearest symbols of how far the show had drifted from its original serious pitch was an infamous episode built entirely around a sentient humanoid carrot, an installment the cast reportedly struggled to film without breaking into laughter. Decades later, TV Guide's ranking of 100 greatest television episodes of all time placed that carrot episode above The City on the Edge of Forever, widely regarded as the single best episode Star Trek ever produced, a strange piece of trivia that says as much about the unpredictability of television history as it does about either show. What outlasted the ratings wars, the budget disputes, and even the actors themselves was the loyalty between the people who lived through it. Long after cancellation, long after Guy Williams died, half a world away, and Jonathan Harris and Bob May had both passed, the surviving members of the Robinson family kept finding their way back to each other at conventions and reunions, decades after the cameras stopped rolling. Marta Kristen, who played the eldest Robinson child, Judy, had a childhood almost nobody guesses from watching her on screen. Born in Norway and adopted by an American family after the war, she grew up largely in Los Angeles and landed the role of Judy Robinson while still a teenager. Of the 3 young Robinson actors, Kristen's character was arguably the least served by the show's drift toward comedy. As Dr. Smith and the robot pulled more and more of the writing staff's attention, Judy Robinson increasingly became a supporting presence in her own family story, given far less to do than her 2 younger siblings. Kristen has spoken candidly in later interviews about how strange it felt to spend her most formative years being recognized primarily for a role that gave her character less and less agency as the seasons went on. Unlike Mumi and Cartwright, who leaned into convention culture early, Kristen kept a lower profile for long stretches of her adult life, working steadily but without ever fully escaping the shadow of the Jupiter 2. She has described the moment she learned about the cancellation as leaving her genuinely speechless, a detail that lines up with how the rest of the cast remembers that day, quiet, cold, and delivered secondhand rather than in person. Even so, by the time cast reunions became a regular fixture of nostalgia television and convention circuits, Kristen was there alongside Mumi and Cartwright, and the 3 of them built a friendship in their 60s, 70s, and 80s that, by their own accounts, felt more genuine than most of what they experienced while the show was actually airing. Mark Goddard, cast as pilot and reluctant father substitute Don West, may have absorbed the professional damage of the show's collapse more directly than anyone else in the main cast. Guy Williams reportedly warned him early on that being associated with a campy science fiction series would function as what Williams bluntly called a career buster. And for Goddard, that prediction largely came true. When Goddard later returned to the stage and appeared on Broadway, he made the unusual decision to leave Lost in Space off his own playable biography, worried the association would undercut how seriously casting directors took him as a dramatic actor. Rather than chasing a Hollywood comeback, Goddard eventually left the industry to pursue a master's degree in education, going on to teach special education students in Massachusetts for years. It's a detail that rarely makes it into retrospectives about the show, but it says something important about how differently each cast member processed the same experience. Some spent decades trying to escape the role, and some, like Goddard, ultimately built a second, quieter career defined by exactly the kind of unglamorous, hands-on patience that television rarely rewards. He died of pulmonary fibrosis in 2023, one of the last surviving adult members of the principal cast at the time of his death. By the 3rd season, the show's writers were leaning so heavily into camp that entire episodes were built around premises that would have been unthinkable given the show's original, serious pitch. The clearest example is the now infamous episode centered on a sentient, human-sized vegetable creature who puts Dr. Smith on trial for the crime of picking a flower. The actor playing the villain spent the entire shoot in a full-body foam rubber carrot costume. and the writer assigned to the script was reportedly so embarrassed by what he'd been asked to produce that he could barely hand the pages over in person. Guy Williams and June Lockhart, veteran professionals who had spent years maintaining composure through objectively strange material, apparently couldn't get through their scenes with a vegetable villain without breaking into laughter, take after take. Irwin Allen, already under pressure from a network growing skeptical of the show's direction, was reportedly furious enough at the repeated breaks that he temporarily wrote both actors out of the following episodes as a kind of punishment, while still paying them for episodes they weren't allowed to appear in. It's a strange footnote precisely because of what happened decades later, when TV Guide published its list of 100 greatest television episodes in history. That same vegetable episode landed on the list, ranked higher than the episode widely considered the creative peak of Star Trek. It's a kind of detail that undercuts any tidy narrative about quality, winning out in the long run. Sometimes the episode that embarrassed everyone involved becomes the one people remember fondly, precisely because it's so unapologetically strange. It's easy to forget, watching the show today, that two of its most prominent young cast members were literally children for most of the production. Bill Mumy was 10 years old when filming began and had already worked steadily as a child actor for several years, earning a reputation among directors for being unusually easy to work with on set. Angela Cartwright, meanwhile, had already spent years in the industry as a child performer before joining the Robinson family, and the two of them were tutored together on the studio lot in between takes, effectively growing up alongside one another in an environment that looked nothing like a normal childhood. Both have spoken in later interviews about how unusual it was to be treated, in some ways like adults on set, expected to hit marks, deliver dialogue on cue, and carry entire storylines, while also being shuttled off to a makeshift schoolroom between scenes to keep up with basic coursework. That strange, accelerated version of childhood is part of what cast members have pointed to when explaining why their bond has lasted as long as it has. People who haven't lived through a childhood spent on a soundstage, surrounded by rubber aliens and painted styrofoam rock formations, tend to have a hard time relating to what that experience actually felt like from the inside. The cast members who share it, by contrast, never really needed to explain it to one another. When Netflix revived the franchise between 2018 and 2021, the creative team behind it made a series of small, deliberate choices that functioned almost like a quiet tribute to the original cast rather than a simple reboot. The new version's take on Dr. Smith was given the full name June Harris, a clear nod to both June Lockhart and Jonathan Harris, folding two beloved original cast members into a single character named decades after Harris's death. Bill Mumy appeared in the new pilot in a small role, credited simply as Dr. Z. Smith, a wink toward the character he'd spent years growing up alongside. Angela Cartwright was brought in during the second season to play Dr. Smith's mother, effectively passing a version of the family torch across two different eras of the same story. And June Lockhart, who had originated the role of the Robinson family matriarch more than 50 years earlier, returned as the voice of Alpha Control in the show's third and final season at 96 years old. It would turn out to be one of her last on-screen credits. She died on October 23, 2025, at her home in Santa Monica, at the age of 100, having lived long enough to see the show reimagined, mocked, celebrated, studied, and finally folded gently back into its own legacy. Reporting at the time noted she'd spent her final years staying engaged with the news, reading multiple papers daily, and remaining, by all accounts, sharp and characteristically unsentimental about her own fame right up until the end. None of this makes Lost in Space a tragedy, exactly. It's something closer to a case study in how television actually gets made, full of executive interference, actors clawing for screen time, physical hazards nobody bothered documenting properly, and a villain who essentially rewrote the show around himself out of sheer professional survival instinct. What makes the story worth revisiting isn't the drama itself, so much as what the cast did with it afterward. Guy Williams found an entirely different kind of stardom on another continent. Bob May turned decades of being uncredited into a reputation for extraordinary generosity toward fans. Mark Goddard walked away from Hollywood recognition altogether and spent his later career teaching children who needed him. And the three surviving Robinson children, Mumy, Cartwright and Kristen, simply kept finding reasons to show up for one another, long after any contract or studio obligation required it. The Robinsons never made it home in the story. The Jupiter 2 never reached Alpha Centauri. The family was never rescued. And the show ended on a cliffhanger nobody got to resolve. But the people who played them, it turns out, never really stopped trying to find their way back to one another. Proof, maybe,